We are live. So random theology again. What I want to talk about is aseity without divine simplicity. And this is a follow-up to my previous discussions. One on the debate between Gavin Ortlund and R.T. Mullins, and then the other between Jake the Muslim metaphysician and Dr. Khalil Andani, right? So just thinking further about aseity, I want to discuss it further. So before I do, I want to recommend some papers. So one of the papers is going to be, it is called Analyzing Aseity, and it is by the authors. So it's going to be Sarah. That's funny, I don't have it here. Let's see if I added it here in my, let's see, Sarah. Well, actually, I think I left it at my desk. So let's see if we can just pull it up real quick. Let's see if we can pull it up. So it's called Analyzing Aseity. That's the paper. So it's Sarah Adams. Let's pull it up. Sarah Adams and Jon Robson. So I recommend that paper. It's an interesting paper. And then I've previously recommended this, but Timothy O'Connor, he has a paper called The Unity of the Divine Nature, 4 Theories. And then another paper by Lindsay Cleveland. It's called Divine Aseity and Abstract Objects. And then the follow-up would be Christian Platonism by Paul M. Gould in the book Divinity of Ontology. And then lastly, since I'm going to talk about Neo-Aristotelian essentialism, I recommend Elucidating Divine Identity by Joshua Sijuwade. And then Mark Makin's paper, it's going to be related to Trinitarianism. So Mark Makin has a paper. Let's see, I don't have it here. He has a lecture you can get online. The Essential Dependence Model of Eternal Generation. It's called God from God, the Essential Dependence Model of Eternal Generation. So I'd recommend those. And then Chad McIntosh has a paper that he should publish in the future, and he currently has it entitled Tri-Aseity. All right, so where do we begin with the discussion of aseity? So what I would say is God is the metaphysical foundation for all reality. This is consistent with Brian Leftow in his book. So God is the metaphysical foundation for all reality. And R.T. Mullins has a great definition in this paper on the creator-creature distinction. He goes a little bit deeper than what I'm going to say here, but further, I want to say God is the sole source, support, sovereign, and standard of all reality. God is neither created, caused, nor depends, nor derives from anything external to God's essential nature. God necessarily exists in virtue of God's essential nature, in virtue of what God is. God necessarily exists. He exists in all possible worlds. God's essential nature is the divine substance and numerically distinct, inseparable attributes. So in that definition, I'm denying a strict, numerically identical view of divine simplicity, right? So this identity thesis. Let's continue. So I want to analyze the nature of aseity. So I want to go deeper. I want to analyze aseity. It may be defined positively or negatively. And in Chad's paper on aseity, he breaks it down like this. So negatively, aseity deals with independence, being underived, unoriginated, unconditioned, uncaused, indestructible, incorruptible. Positively, aseity often is related to self-existent, self-sufficient, metaphysically absolute, ultimate ground of being, self-caused. In Latin, it's causa sui, self-grounded, fundamental. So it could be defined positively or negatively. It asserts a substance or being is neither created, caused, explained, nor depends upon anything external to itself. Which brings us to the dilemma that has been posed. If God has numerically distinct, inseparable properties or attributes, are they ase? If they are ase, and really the question would be, how do we understand aseity, right? Given that question, we need to analyze aseity. What is meant by that, right? If it's understood as independence, if the attributes are ase, then they do not depend on God. If the attributes are not ase, so if the attributes are ase, then they do not depend upon God. If the attributes are not ase, then how can such attributes count as God's attributes, right? So I point off immediately, if by aseity someone merely means that the divine attributes are uncreated, uncaused, and necessary, then that's fine. I would gladly say that God's numerically distinct, inseparable attributes are ase, if we simply mean that they're uncreated, uncaused, and necessary, right? And that they're possessed by God. But this dilemma is assuming a definition of independence, right? That's really, the dilemma is set up with the definition of aseity as independence, as non-dependent. So I want to provide some responses to this dilemma. First, a more traditional response is to make a distinction between fundamental and derivative aseity. And this would be using the Aristotelian distinction between substance and attribute. Now, this is a similar move to John Calvin in his claim that the divine Son, the second person of the Trinity, is autotheos. So how can we make sense of this definition, or this distinction? The distinction of fundamental and derivative aseity. So the necessary and sufficient conditions of an aseity distinction has to do with relations. The divine attributes are derivatively ase in relation to anything external to the divine nature. And the divine nature is understood as the conjunction of the divine substance and the numerically distinct, inseparable attributes. The divine attributes do not depend upon anything non-divine, anything external to the divine nature. Right? So that would be the distinction between derivative and fundamental. Right? So I want to make sure that that's clear. So really what we're saying is there's two layers to aseity for that distinction to work, for fundamental and derivative aseity. But perhaps you might be unconvinced that there is such a distinction. So then here is the second way. So the second way is to challenge the coherence of ase attributes as independent within an Aristotelian metaphysics. If properties are either possessed or produced by a substance, then properties characterized as ase are similar to square circles. They're metaphysically impossible. There cannot be attributes that would be independent of substances, right? In some way, shape, or form. So that would be the claim here. If ase attributes as independent are metaphysically impossible, then it is not a liability for God to not possess such attributes. So on this view, only substances are metaphysically possible to be ase. Hence, it would be a category error to demand for any ase attributes. All right, let's continue. This is just a thought that it seems aseity comes in a restrictive and unrestrictive mode, similar to omnipotence or the principle of sufficient reason. Right? We all understand that God does not have unrestricted omnipotence. God cannot create a rock so heavy that he cannot lift and not lift, right? Or God cannot do that which is logically impossible, right? God cannot change the past if you affirm some type of four-dimensionalism or eternalism, right? God cannot do that which is contrary to who and what God is, right? So we understand that there's a restriction, the type of omnipotence God has. Well, I think that the same can be said about aseity, that the type of aseity God has would be restrictive, such that God would be able to have numerically distinct, inseparable attributes, right? And that would not be problematic for God to have such attributes. What I advocate is for a restrictive aseity that allows God to be the fundamental asymmetrical ground or explanation for God's numerically distinct, inseparable attributes that neither diminishes nor degrades the ase divine nature, right? All right, so a third response. Given Neo-Aristotelian metaphysics, so think of essentialism with real definitions. So essentialism says that something has a core essence to it and that it can be defined in propositions. And so if that's true, then the real definition of God may be formulated to show there is nothing problematic with God being ase with numerically distinct, inseparable attributes. In such a case, it would not diminish nor degrade God, given the divine attributes are essential constituents in the divine, I should say it this way. It would not diminish nor degrade God if God has numerically distinct, inseparable attributes, because such attributes are essential constituents in the real definition of God. And I would recommend Dr. Sijuwade's paper, Elucidating Divine Identity, on this to go deeper. He does a great job discussing Kit Fine's work. You can come up with your own definition, but here is a real definition for God, one possible one, and it's going to assume the Trinity because I'm a Trinitarian. To be God is to be a particular object that is a triune being, eternally self-existent, omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect, the sole creator and sustainer of the universe, all of these attributes, all of these numerically distinct, inseparable attributes are essential constituents of the real definition of God. Okay? And I go deeper into what does it mean to be triune. I take triune to mean that God is three distinct and co-equal persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, whose divinity and unity are explained by essential dependence. So I'm using Mark Makin's work here. Each person of the Trinity possesses together numerically distinct divine attributes. So they're doing this together. They don't each have their own separate attributes. That would go against my understanding of the Trinity. So they possess, the three persons together possess the numerically distinct divine attributes, reflecting their individual essence. Right now I'm using the Aristotelian distinction between individual and general essence right now. Don't take it in a confusing way where you think there's more than one essence. There's only one essence of God, okay? There's only one divine substance. We're talking about something different here. So the three persons, their individual essence, each individual essence of each person reflects the numerically distinct divine attributes. They express those attributes, yet they remain one in their general essence and in the expression of the divine nature. Or we can follow William Hasker and say it this way, that the three persons, the three divine persons are constituted by the divine nature, and the divine nature is a single trope of divinity that would explain the three divine persons, and then the three divine persons would explain the numerically distinct divine attributes, the numerically distinct, inseparable divine attributes. All right, continuing on. Another response would be to say that to argue all God's attributes must be ase may demand each divine attribute be multi-propertied. And if that's the case, then that may lead, such an ontic requirement may lead to an infinite regress. And so we need to make God's divine attributes, numerically distinct, inseparable attributes, that needs to be the termination point. You're not going to be able to say that each divine attribute must be multi-propertied, because in some sense you're assuming divine simplicity, because divine simplicity tries to say that each attribute are numerically identical. And that's basically what they're demanding in this criticism, if there is such a criticism, that each divine attribute must be multi-propertied. If that's the claim, it's because there's a prejudice. Someone is assuming a identity thesis of divine simplicity and criticizing the idea that God has numerically distinct, inseparable attributes because they do not have the same ability as divine simplicity as identity, right? Because on that view, all the divine attributes are synonymous in some way, shape, or form. Or I should say it this way, that all the divine attributes are numerically identical, right? Where in this case, they're not, right? They're numerically distinct. Mm-hmm. Okay. So fifth, which is the last resort, revise aseity altogether. Chad McIntosh advocates this. I'm not quite ready to give up on aseity, but one could revise aseity altogether. Affirm God is symmetrically mutually dependent upon God's divine attributes, in which case aseity would be revised. Aseity would be revised to affirm God's nature, the divine substance and attributes, is neither created, caused, explained, nor depends upon anything external to the divine nature. This assumes there is more than one way to be divine, at least three ways to be divine. Substance, so the divine substance, the divine attributes, and then the conjunction of the divine substance and attributes, right? Or you could think of this in terms of the whole and the parts. right? So I don't have an issue with that, but what I have an issue with is revising Aseity without seeing if there's, without going through all the other options, right? So what can we say? How is it that if God doesn't have independent attributes, I'm just thinking, if God had, if God doesn't have independent attributes, that doesn't diminish or degrade God. It doesn't. And how would God, possessing numerically distinct, inseparable attributes, how could they be divine? Well, the reason why they would be divine is because God is the explanation. God is the asymmetrical explanation of those attributes, right? God's attributes are divine precisely because God possesses them in a mode that is from God and not from another. The divine substance's unique possession, ownership, or fusion, think of like a fusion bond, to the attributes make them divine. God is the property bearer, which entails the properties are divine. Now, some might say, okay, Ryan, I get it. So it's possible for God to possess numerically distinct attributes, and they're uncreated, they're uncaused, they're explained by God, who is Ase, the divine substance is Ase, and it's not problematic. So if you admit that, then there's another worry. Well, are the divine attributes infinite? So when it comes to infinity, infinity is very difficult to get a clear definition. And again, we're going to need to make a distinction between, either we could say minimal or maximal infinity, or we can restricted and unrestricted, right? We need to make these fine distinctions, because if we don't, we can end up with pantheism or panentheism when it comes to infinity. Now, some theologians, I'm thinking of like Dr. Gordon Clark and others, they say that we should not say that God is infinite, because for them, infinity entails pantheism. Because if the way that it's articulated is if God is infinite, then he is unbounded. He has no limits in any way, shape, or form. And if God is not limited in any way, shape, or form, then he cannot be limited by what is spatial, physical, or temporal. And therefore, he must be numerically identical to that which is physical, spatial, temporal. Right? And that's kind of how Spinoza goes, and that's how others go. In Spinoza's Ethics, he argues this from his axioms, that God must be, he argues for monism, right? And I want to deny that, right? I want to deny any hint of that, but I still want to use I'm willing to use the term that God is infinite and that God's attributes are infinite. And this is typically discussed in terms of like circles, right? So you can have circles that would be used to specify the divine attributes, and they're infinite in the sense that there's no beginning or end, right? And that they're, in terms of intensity and the intensive and extensive, the nature of the divine attributes is there is no limit. There is no boundary in terms of the specific attribute, right? But then someone will say, well, wouldn't one attribute limit the other? And again, what we're going to have to take a restricted understanding of infinity. If we don't, we can end up with pantheism. And so what I would want to articulate is the type of infinity God has in terms of God's attributes would be the type of infinity in which the divine attributes would not compete or contradict each other, and they would not. They would be consistent with who and what God is, and in terms of intensity, intensive and extensive, they're going to be unlimited, right? And unlimited without conflicting with each other, right? And so that's kind of the way I understand infinity. Sometimes this is articulated as infinite in degree, right? Qualitatively, they're infinite in degree. So God's omnipotence, God has all power. But as I've stated earlier, the type of omnipotence God would have would be that which God can do that which is logically possible to do, right? Or perhaps a different attribute. So omniscience, God knows all truths and doesn't believe any falsehoods, right? And so in degree, God has infinite knowledge. He knows all true propositions, right? There's no limit to God's knowledge. God is not ignorant, right? So that would be my understanding of infinity. But some may take a different view than that. But we do need to be careful to not make unrestricted claims in terms of attributes toward God, because we may end up affirming something that would be contrary to God's perfection, right? And in the case of infinity, we could, if we're not careful, if we don't carefully define what we mean, we could end up with pantheism or panentheism, which we don't want to do that. We want to protect the creator-creature distinction. All right. And then kind of as an aside, someone said, I saw on Facebook or Twitter that someone was making the point that, if God needs his attributes, then he's not perfect. And here again, we need to define our terms. What is meant by perfection, right? God needs his attributes. That's like saying, to me, that's humorous, because need implies something that God lacks. And if God has numerically distinct attributes, if God possesses numerically distinct attributes that are inseparable, God would lack nothing. And to say that God needs them is to assume that there's a mutual symmetrical dependence relation there. And I'm denying that, right? So that wouldn't be, that argument wouldn't work for my view. But I would also argue further that perfect must be defined to get such an argument off the ground. If perfect is the possession of all great-making properties, then God, as the property bearer of such properties, is by definition perfect. And we saw that in the real definition of God that I articulated earlier. The property bearer or owner is perfect in virtue of the property bearer's possession, right? And that possession is in a mode from God and not from another, right? Which characterizes or articulates aseity, right? The divine substance is ase. All right. Yeah. And then I had this random thought. So in terms of, Gregory Fowler, in his paper, Simplicity, Priority or Simplicity, there's some things there, and then Matthew Badendorf on his paper on aseity and divine sovereignty. Some of those papers, and then also contrasting that with some other ideas that I've had, I wonder if I said that if a attribute does not share the same attribute, so if an attribute is distinct from another attribute, which is distinct from the whole, right? So think of it in terms of parts and wholes. So if a part does not share the same property as the whole, but the whole can ground the parts that may confer a property of the whole to the parts in some way, shape, or form. So I was just thinking, this is probably way off topic here, but I was just thinking about how sometimes people apply where we can ascribe a property to the whole. So, for example, if you have a brick wall and all the bricks are red, you say that the brick wall is red, right? But in fact, all the bricks are distinctly red as well, and you can identify that red brick, right? But you can also identify the whole wall as red. And I was just thinking about how the part does not share the same property as the whole. And right now I'm thinking of like one brick is not the exact same as the other brick, right? But the whole can ground the parts and may confer a property of the whole to the parts in some way, shape, or form. And in this case, the brick wall, I don't know if the brick wall analogy would work, but I just random thought that for a brick wall, you have individual bricks and they're all red. The whole wall is red, right? And so obviously you would say the brick wall, right? And then we would be able to pinpoint a specific brick and say a brick, right? And then we would say the whole wall is red and each individual brick is red. So collectively and individually, sometimes the individual can represent the collective. And that thought just occurred to me. May not be, it's not really relevant here, but just some random thoughts consistent with random theology, right? All right, so I pray that this might be interesting to you. I would highly recommend, though, for those that are trying to navigate the divine simplicity, that you would look at this paper by Timothy O'Connor. If you need a copy of it, email me, right? Email me. But it's by Timothy O'Connor, The Unity of the Divine Nature, 4 Theories. I think you really appreciate this paper. It's a new paper. I emailed Dr. O'Connor recently. I hope, Lord willing, he'll respond to me. I had some questions for him, and then Dr. Sijuwade's paper, Elucidating Divine Identity. Get this paper. It's free on Phil Papers, and Dr. Sijuwade puts everything on his academia page. So go to academia.edu and create a free profile and get the paper for free. Let me make sure I didn't have any other thoughts or comments here before we end the stream. Because all right. Yeah. Don't have anything further to add. Pray this would be interesting and helpful. And if it's not, then may it be entertaining. If it's not helpful, may it be entertaining. Peace and God bless. Oh, should mention, look, my shirt, that's Modalism Patrick. All right. Peace and God bless.